I'm very excited to be here. I have been looking forward to this conference since I first heard rumblings about it. Maybe was it like last winter? I think Perry might have casually dropped that he was thinking about doing something or getting something together. So I have been anticipating this moment for the entire time. The lineup is fantastic and absurd, and I am grateful that I am going first because I don't want to follow anybody else on this lineup. That's too much pressure for me to deal with. Since it is the first one, I was curious who showed up. So how many people would call themselves a developer? Yeah, how many people would call themselves a designer? Couple people? No boos, who booed? How many people would call themselves project managers or something else entirely? Okay, all right, cool. So a nice little mix. That's good. I like that. I think that performance is, as we'll kind of be exploring over the next couple days for sure, it touches every aspect. So it's important to get everybody in the same room. One last question. How many people think what they do is in some way creative work? Most hands are up. Okay. For those of you who didn't lift your hands, you should have. If you're in this room, it means you're doing something performance-related, and if you're doing something performance-related, it's a creative endeavor, whether that's the project management side of things, whether that's the design, whether it's the more technical aspects. I think we tend to overlook how much creativity has to go into the technical work that we do. And it's not something just reflective of how we view our own profession, but we put that on other professions as well. For example, think about the last time you read a book or you looked at a book and you thought, man, the person who wrote this had to be really highly creative. Can you picture an article or a book in your head right now? How many folks are thinking of the dictionary? Yeah, nobody, right? It's the antithesis of everything that we think is creative, right? The dictionary it's old, it's stuffy, it's static. Very few of us, there's probably somebody in this room, and it's okay, it's a safe space, but there's probably somebody in this room who reads the dictionary. But for the rest of us, this is something we would never endeavor to do. It's something that we consider not creative in any way, shape, or form. But the act of writing a dictionary, the act of defining those words, incredibly creative. There's a fantastic book called Word by Word, The Secret Life of Dictionaries, written by a lexicographer at Merriam-Webster. And she gives numerous examples throughout the book of just how involved and creative the process can be. So for example, consider the two words teensy and measly. Now, first off, before I get into this too much, Brits in the room, I get it. I'm sorry. The American is on stage talking about your language. This is it goes against everything you believe in. Just give me these few minutes, and I swear I will not call anything awesome for at least 10 minutes. All right? Okay. Now, for those of you who English may not be your first language, maybe it's your second, your third, your fourth, your fifth, you may not be aware of what teensy and measly mean. They're synonyms for the word small. You could use them in the same place that you might use small. But they have different connotations that they bring along with them. So I wanted to use them in a sentence. Unfortunately, Harry, I speak in the morning, so I can only have one small cocktail. This is, by the way, a completely hypothetical conversation. Any resemblance to actual speakers or events is coincidental. All right, so small cocktail. Now, that describes that the cocktail is not massive. It's a small thing, but there's no emotion that really comes along with it, right? Let's substitute teensy in there. Unfortunately, Harry, I speak in the morning, so I can only have a teensy cocktail. Now, that sounds a lot more playful. You can imagine me saying this with a wink, and then 12 cocktails later, I actually call it a night. Again, completely hypothetical situation here. Let's try measly. Unfortunately, Harry, I speak in the morning, so I can only have one measly cocktail. The playfulness is gone. Now I sound grumpy. I sound bitter. I sound like I'm angry about my inability to have more than one cocktail. I sound like I might need a little bit of counseling, right? Measly has an entirely different emotion that it brings along with it. So there are little differences between these different variations of the same basic premise, the same idea of small, but they have different contexts that they come along with. Now, as a lexicographer, your job is to identify that. You have to be able to look at the different variations of the word. You have to be able to look at how they're used in language. How are people using them in sentences when they talk and when they write? And what are they trying to get across? What is the message? Why are they choosing that word? What is the emotion they want to bring along with that conversation? And then you have to find a way to put that into a concise definition. In the case of teensy, it ends up being informal tiny, which is, all right, yeah, it's informal. I could get that. I think it could be a little bit more playful. I do like the definition for measly. It's contemptibly small. I like that contemptibly. It's very enforceful. And you have to do this for every word that goes into the dictionary. And sometimes this is an incredibly involved process, and it can be incredibly creative. It can take hours, it can take days of back and forth between different lexicographers to come up with what the actual definition that they want to capture is, what the essence of the word is. And again, it's because it's capturing language as it is used, not how it is supposed to be used. The dictionary, we think of it as a very static document. It's not in any way, shape, or form because the language that we use is constantly changing, and it's influenced by the culture we live in and by the context. And so definitions change, new words emerge. I remember, I think I was a senior in high school, and my English teacher had this huge fit because the Oxford Dictionary decided to add Bootylicious into the dictionary, and she just threw a hissy fit about it. You're welcome, Bruce. This is the actual, if you look this up, this is the actual definition you'll find. So you get new words like bootylicious that emerge. You get words that change. So we have a situation now where literally can mean the exact opposite. It can mean not literally. It can mean figuratively, which riles a few people up, but it's actually, there's precedent for this. If you think about when people used to say, I'm bad, like that, but they sounded a little cooler when they said it, not whatever the heck that was. It meant that they were actually good, like good equals bad. There's actually a definition of up that is equivalent to another definition of down if you go far enough down the definition list. So there's precedent for words meaning the exact opposite of what they're supposed to mean. But it's all because it captures the changes in the variations. The lexicographer who wrote the book talked about how when a dictionary is out, it is immediately outdated, immediately. They have that in common with JavaScript frameworks. The dictionary is constantly changing because the words we use change, and those definitions change, and they have to, because if they don't, then they're dying. We've seen web performance already go through a shift. If you go back far enough, the idea of front-end performance wasn't always there. Now, I don't mean to say that people were not paying attention to performance on the front end. That absolutely was happening. But when you use the word web performance, you were typically talking about back-end optimizations. That was the primary driver of the conversation. Front-end performance didn't really become its own thing that sort of was considered included in that conversation until sometime in the early 2000s. There was a little bit of rumbling there where it was starting to build up more and more as a term, more and more as a focus. And then it was sort of catapulted forward in around 2007 or so when YSlow came out as an extension for the Firebug. If anybody remembers Firebug, which was fantastic. YSlow came out as an extension for that, which had these 13 performance rules, a lot of them front-end focused. Steve Sodders released high-performance websites that same year. In 2008, Velocity came out back when it used to be a performance conference and gave a dedicated place for people to talk about this. And it sort of took this snowball that had been building up and pushed it across the finish line. And suddenly, when we talk about web performance now, front end is a dominating part of that conversation. We expanded the definition of web performance. I feel like we're on the cusp of another one of those sort of expansions. See, that's why the English people are saying the Americans shouldn't be talking about the language, because you can't even talk straight. I think we're on the cusp of another one. We were talking these last few years about shifting more and more of the focus on the user, making performance very user-centric. We're seeing it in the metrics that we use and in the conversations that we have. I think this has happened in no small part because performance has started to hit more mainstream web events. Used to be you had to go to Velocity to talk about performance. You couldn't, if you went to most general web conferences, performance typically wasn't covered. Now, you go to any general conference, you're probably going to get at least a couple talks that are exclusively about performance, and most talks are going to include some sort of narrative about performance inside of them. We're having this discussion with a wider group of people with different roles inside the organization, and as we do, we're starting to shift the narrative a little bit. And I hope the tipping point happens soon. I hope that DeltaV ends up being a part of this because it can't happen soon enough because we have a massive performance problem online. For all the additional conversation that we're having, for all of the additional attention performance is getting, there are still some massive concerns. There are some fundamental truths about the web that we tend to ignore because they're inconvenient. The web is incredibly network constrained. I know we get spoiled on these high-speed connections, that we have access to, particularly at work or on our mobiles. And so we tend to sort of maybe it's tempting to consider that the network issues are not as significant as they used to be. That's not the case for most people around the world. According to GSMA, 71% of the global population connects using a 2G or 3G network. 71%. Now, this is actually skewed, too. Like, if you look at certain regions, like in the Middle East and North Africa, it's 92%. South Africa is 96%. The reason why this number is so low is because Europe comes in at 59% and North America comes in at 32%. We have an extremely rosy picture of what it means to have a network connection to the web. We're very network constrained, but we don't build like that. If you look at the sites that we're building, the median is 1.5 megabytes. The average, if you were expecting a bigger number, we used to use averages. We're now using medians. The average is still ridiculous. It's like 4,000 kilobytes. It's terrifying. In the 90th percentile, so 90% of all experiences, are 5,754 kilobytes or less. That's a lot of weight. That's also a long tail, by the way. That's why you don't ever just look at the median. Look at the gap between the two. There's a very different experience. And that 90th percentile is so key because it's not just the same person sitting over there, the 90th person out of 100. It's all of us at one point or another are going to end up with that experience. We're going to be hitting those things. We're providing very heavy sites. We're also very device constrained on the web. I have a Google Pixel 2. It's a very powerful device. It is the opposite of being constrained. Most of us in this room probably have pretty powerful devices. I'm guessing there's a lot of iPhones in the room, probably some Samsung stuff. I'm guessing most of us have phones that were released within the last 2, maybe 3 years. There could be a few exceptions here. But we have typically pretty powerful high-end devices in our hands and on our machines at work, too. But that's not what's typical, again, of most people around the world. Right now, we're seeing this sort of explosion of people migrating from feature phones to more smartphone adoption, and it's being driven by cheap Android devices in that $100 to $200 range. Now, devices in that range have limited CPU power. Sometimes the CPU seems okay, but there's actually some limitations in terms of memory and cache that end up throttling the performance of the device anyway. They're underpowered devices. If you want to experience what it's like, and you don't want to just buy the new one, I guess, go grab an Android phone that was being sold about 5 years ago. That's probably where you're at in terms of device performance, somewhere around there. And yet, when I do performance profiling, I'm seeing more and more of this color. Does anybody know what this color means? Any jumping out to anybody? This is the color that Chrome uses in the timeline trace for script work being done on the CPU, on the main thread of the browser. So here I've got a trace. This is from a desktop, by the way. This is on a MacBook Pro. And this is showing how much CPU utilization is going on just to load the page at first. The yellow you see is scripting. There's some painting and some layout going on, but it's mostly script. And it's maxed out from the majority of the time that it takes to load the page. Now imagine trying to process this on a $100 Android phone. It's chaos. And most of the time it doesn't work. Or if it does, it takes forever. We send, on the median, 352 kilobytes of JavaScript, or 1,000 kilobytes at the 90th percentile down. That's the network cost. That's when it's compressed nicely with gzip. What the browser, what the device has to deal with is the uncompressed version. This roughly equates to about 2,400 kilobytes at the median, or just under 7,000 for the 90th percentile. That's a lot of freaking JavaScript code. I don't know if anybody remembers, Ronan Kremen a few years ago wrote this post about how the web was approaching Doom levels in terms of the average page weight. Doom was 2,340 kilobytes. It was 60 kilobytes less than the median page loads in JavaScript. Just JavaScript. No fonts, no images, no videos, nothing but JavaScript. That's a lot of code just to display a single page. And the result is the CPU has to work like crazy. To get a page loaded, we're talking about 1.2 seconds of time the CPU is spending on just JavaScript on the median, and is up to 5.3 seconds for that 90th percentile. The web is network and device constrained, but we don't really build like that. We're building a web of excess. And that excess ends up leading to some outcomes that I'm personally not very comfortable with. A little while back, Apple came out with Apple News. Facebook has Instant Articles. Google has AMP. I know technically it's not a Google project, but if you look at all the contributors, 95% of the contributions actually come from Google employees, even if there's more non-Google employees that are listed as contributors. For all intensive purposes, I lump it in the same group. All three of these came in and said, you know what? The web is too slow. You got to use this instead. We'll fix it for you. Performance is not going to be fixed by some top-down approach. I promise that's not how we're going to fix the issue. For one thing, anytime anything comes from the top down, there are other goals involved. There's baggage that comes with that. Nobody does that altruistically. They have other objectives they want to achieve. But for another thing, performance isn't just something we just slap a Band-Aid on and then pretend like everything's okay. The underlying performance issues are still there. We're just sort of changing the format a little bit. It's a deeper cultural issue. The way that we fix this is by recognizing that performance is a cultural issue and that it touches every aspect of our organization, every aspect of the digital experience. You know, performance is a business problem. And I don't mean from the perspective of performance and what it correlates to in terms of improvements in your business. That absolutely makes sense. I get it. Better performance means better, lower bounce rates. It means more sessions. It means better engagement. All of those things are great. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is the business decisions that we make impact the performance of our products. This is a visualization built by Simon called Request Map that you can see on your web page test runs. And this is CNN.com. And what you're seeing here is the initial request made for CNN. And you're seeing all of these little dots out here. That's all of the different third-party domains and third-party content that's being pulled into CNN.com. Look at how many different resources we're pulling from how many different places. That's all that third-party stuff. And it's there for advertising, it's there for analytics, it's there for tag management. There are business decisions that are backing why we're doing these sorts of things. But look at the cost. Look at how much we're pulling in from everywhere else. I mean, I go into so many people talk about performance and they say, yeah, all of this sounds great, but what about the third parties? I won't get into that because we got a whole other talk about that, but it is a very real problem that we have to deal with, and it's because those business considerations impact our performance. We have to be thinking about it very early on. These decisions have a direct tie to the content strategy situation as well. Performance is definitely a content strategy problem. How many people have ever worked at a place, or maybe you work at a place now, that uses WordPress, and WordPress was brought in? Why? Because WordPress is built very well to handle marketing and SEO and all that kind of stuff. It has a fantastic plugin architecture. It has a fantastic ecosystem of supporting plugins and extensions that handle all of these things for you. But none of that stuff is free. Every time you pull in those different plugins, those different extensions, you're adding some sort of bloat. They typically carry some JavaScript baggage, some CSS baggage. You're adding all of these things to your site. There's always a trade-off being made. Performance is absolutely the content strategy problem. This is something that the New York Times learned the hard way. In 2013, they gave a talk about shifting from what had been a static-generated approach to content to a more dynamic system. Now, nowadays, we think of static-generated markup, we think yay for performance, right? Everybody loves their Jekyll and Hugo sites and Netlify for backing it, and it's really fast and quick. But in 2004, when they started this, the system wasn't nearly as robust. So what ended up happening is they produced over a decade of around 1 million different pages where the content and the markup were tightly coupled. So they couldn't go back and easily change things. It was very timely and costly to do that. So you ended up with this baggage that continued to accumulate. 1 million pages with this bloated markup. The CMS allowed content creators to dump anything they wanted to within a page. So you looked inside an individual post, and there were imports, there were inline styles, there was all sorts of chaos. So to counter that, the developers had to write some JavaScript, make sure that it blocked the rest of the page load, put it in the header to override all the stuff that the content creators were doing down here. Fundamental considerations for performance had to be completely ignored because of the way that they had stored and updated and handled their content creation process. They couldn't fix it until, like I said, a decade later when they were able to finally set aside the budget and the time necessary to go back in and do an expensive overhaul, take all these millions of pages and reformat them and decouple them from the markup, get rid of all the bloat. Now, I guarantee that in 2004, nobody was probably thinking about this. Nobody was thinking about that long-term impact of the way that they were handling their content. But it had very real performance implications. But this goes both ways. We talk a lot about how we want performance to be included in these discussions. We want them in the business discussion. We want them in the content strategy discussion. We have to make sure that we're considering other aspects as well in the performance discussion. It's not just blindly about making things as fast as they can go. Performance can be a security problem. I remember when folks were kind of advocating for this shift to HTTPS, and there were many valid reasons why it would take you a while to move to HTTPS or why you may not have wanted to. Performance, I thought, was one of the more questionable ones. There was this argument that because HTTPS added that SSL negotiation step, that there was a little bit of delay, which is true, although there are some performance things you can do to make that less painful. I'm not comfortable making that trade, though, like saying that, you know what, a few hundred milliseconds is worth the risk in privacy and having information exposed. I think there's an uncomfortable trade-off there. This is a lesson that we learned pretty hard with Spectre and Meltdown. I don't know how familiar anybody is with these. These were like these massive CPU vulnerabilities that just popped up. And the reason why they occur is because we like our computers to be really fast. And CPUs try to get faster and faster and faster. Now, there's raw speed, but there's also some shortcuts that they try to apply here and there. And one of those shortcuts is called speculative execution. I've heard this compared to like if you go into a coffee shop day after day after day and order the same thing, eventually your coffee shop just kind of has the cup waiting for you. That would be speculative execution. They're like kind of working ahead of time. It kind of works. Here's some simplified code, very stripped down, just to kind of show what speculative execution would entail. So we start off with, we set an object of my data. It has 4 items inside of it. I set a variable of item and set it to 1,000. Then I come down and I say, okay, if the value of item is less than the size of my object, which it is definitely not, then go ahead and retrieve the item that sits at that part in the object, and my data 1,000 in this case. Now we read this linearly, and we see that, okay, definitely we're never going to execute what's inside of this if statement. Right? This doesn't need to happen. But the CPU can move so quickly that it doesn't make sense for it to view it that same step-by-step process. So what the CPU does is the CPU comes along and it says, oh, wait, okay, while I'm figuring this part out, I'm going to keep going ahead and executing some code ahead of time. And I'm going to execute this. I'm going to speculatively execute what happens inside of the if statement. So what happens is then eventually it says, okay, I didn't need to do that. Item was greater than my data.size. What does it do with the results of this execution? It tosses it off into another part of memory, which happens to be unprotected and unsecured. And now an attacker figured out that what you can do is if you can write the right code, you can get the CPU to do speculative execution, you can get all sorts of private information that is now stored in this other area that you can get access to. It was a performance optimization that was made without considering what the potential security implications are of that performance optimization. I'm a big proponent. I love Paul Lewis's whole 3 unsexy pillars of the web statement about security, accessibility, and performance. But it's important to note that there are 3 of them and that they all work together. And if you knock down one of the pillars, just like if we knock down one of the pillars off to the side here, the whole foundation is going to crumble. Right? It's not one trumps the other. They have to work in concert. Now, accessibility and performance, they go very nicely hand in hand. They work extremely well together. You know, there are considerations around accessible tech. There's going to be a talk later about the accessibility tree. When we think about the document object model and the render tree in terms of performance, but there's this other tree that gets created of information for accessible tech to use. And anytime we're making, unperformant changes to the document object model or render tree, it's also impacting that accessibility tree. And accessible tech tends to not be quite as performant. A lot of that stuff, screen readers in particular, can be pretty dated in some of their support and some of their performance improvements. So sometimes that update can take quite a while and leave people hanging and waiting. There's also just basic access considerations. Can people afford the data that we're sending them? Can their devices and their network support what we're actually building? This is a Kindle. I have a Kindle. I love the Kindle for reading. I think it's a fantastic reading device. There is an experimental web browser. It's probably forever going to be called experimental. There is a web browser on the Kindle that you can use, and it's not bad, actually. The Kindle is not a high-powered device, though. It's not particularly anything that we would consider to be high-powered in any shape or form. It's meant primarily for reading. It's e-ink. There's no backlighting. Brad Frost talked about how a relative of his got in touch with him one time and said, hey, I've been trying to browse the web on the Kindle, and everything just keeps crashing. Every time I go to a new site, it crashes. I can't ever seem to move more than a couple pages at once. What's going on? And Brad's like, well, people, I'm guessing, are not testing on these low-end devices. Raise your hand if you've ever tested on a Kindle. I expected one or a couple hands. Yeah, that's about right. OK. Yeah, it's not something we would think of as a primary device, right? In her situation, she's not doing it because of some sort of weird ignorance thing. She's not doing it to be annoying. She's doing it because she gets debilitating migraines from backlit displays. So if she tries to browse the web on a laptop or on a phone, she can't do it, right? It causes these massive migraine headaches. So the Kindle, with its e-ink display and no backlighting, represents an affordable option for her to actually be able to browse the web without pain. And so when we decide whether or not we're going to pay attention to how our sites perform on those devices, as she put it, it makes the difference between minimizing her computer use and being able to use the web freely. We don't think like that often when we're talking about the performance of our sites. We don't often think about the people that we're leaving out, but increasingly that's the situation. Increasingly, as we build these CPU-intensive, heavy sites, we're deciding that certain people aren't going to get to use it. the connection between accessibility and performance can actually be quite mind-blowing. I think there's some really great revolutions when you look at performance from an inclusivity perspective. There's a great paper that Marcy Sutton pointed me in the direction of entitled The Keystroke Level Model for User Performance Time with Interactive Systems. That's a mouthful. People with white papers abbreviate the titles. The basic premise here is that this is somebody who's arguing, instead of viewing performance strictly in terms of milliseconds and seconds, what if we measured performance in terms of the number of keystrokes it took for the person to complete their objective? It's interesting on a couple levels. First off, there's a practical use here, right? There's a lot of people who can't use the mouse. They're restricted to the keyboard, both situationally and permanently. And thinking about how many keystrokes it takes to get to where they want to go is absolutely a valuable exercise. If you are kind of like, yeah, I'm so convinced about that, Tim, go use your site without a mouse, and I guarantee you you're going to change your perspective, because as soon as you start tabbing through like a 20 or 50 item navigation thing just to get to the content you want to do, you will immediately change the way you look at this. But I also think it's a really interesting thought exercise. Like, is performance really just about time? Is it really just about the milliseconds and seconds we spent? It seems like a fairly myopic definition, doesn't it? What if performance isn't just about time? What if it's about the level of effort that's involved? What if it's about the limitations in human memory? What if it's about actual being able to complete that task and how efficiently that occurs? I think this is a natural progression of where we're headed, by the way. This idea of task completion being something that we're looking at and tying into performance. Because as we come to recognize that performance is a user experience problem, we're already sort of taking some steps in that direction. And we're going to get a great talk about metrics, but we're shifting from this thing where traditionally we've looked at things like page load or document complete, or the metrics that have very questionable ties to the actual user experience. And we're starting to shift towards things like, when is the page actually interactive? When does meaningful content get displayed? When is my hero image or my header or whatever happens to be displayed? We're starting to get closer and closer to like what matters to the user, right? What ultimately matters is the task that they're trying to complete and how efficiently they can accomplish that. It seems so obvious that I wonder why we haven't been paying more attention to the whole journey this entire time instead of these individual steps along the way. And it's not a particularly new concept either. There is a post back in 2006 on the UIE blog about some research that was done around this. Now remember, 2006, this is right on the cusp of when performance was really starting to take off in terms of this front-end conversation and really being cemented that was a big aspect of it. The post, interestingly, comes at it from the approach of, Jacob Nielsen. Anybody familiar with Jacob Nielsen? He has some really good stuff, some really questionable stuff, but all of it is very strongly stated. And he was really hammering at the time about performance, and I think he was saying something about like you want to be 10 seconds at the time was his goal for your performance of your site, based on the fact that the most popular sites he saw were 8 seconds to download, the less popular were 19, so he kind of cut it in half, I guess. I don't know. He was advocating for why you needed to spend more time on performance. So this research was to see if that was really the case. So what they did is they took a bunch of people and they shoved them in a room, gently shoved them in a room probably, and they gave them a computer, and then they said, okay, you're going to accomplish, like here, go accomplish a task on Amazon.com, go do it on About.com, do it on, I think they gave them like 7 or 8 different sites and said, try to accomplish the task you want to do there. And then at the end of it, the people who were participating in the research were required to then rank the sites in terms of which ones they felt were the fastest and which ones they felt were the slowest. Now, what the researchers were doing in the background was they were timing the actual page load. So they knew the actual time it took for these sites to load and how quickly they displayed. And they were also paying attention to whether or not the person in the research study was able to complete their task on any given site. So they knew if the task was completed and how long it actually took for the page to load, and the user was just using it and then ranking, like I said. So what they ended up finding was that there was no correlation between traditional performance and the actual ranking that the users had. They were consistently ranking sites that were the slowest sites performance-wise at the top in terms of speed, and the sites that were some of the fastest ones were coming in at the bottom, and they were saying they were the slowest. The correlation came from task completion and that ranking of performance. If they were able to complete their task, those sites were consistently ranked as high speed, as fast. When they weren't able to complete their tasks, those were considered to be slow. The conclusion of the article I kind of disagreed with. I disagreed with. The conclusion of the article was, well, maybe we don't need to be throwing our resources at performance. I think that's the wrong takeaway from this study. We absolutely need to be doing that. The conclusion I take from this study is that, boy, maybe we have just too myopic of a definition, right? We're focusing on like page load time in this study, and like that's the performance that we were trying to measure, and just raw speed and raw power, and giving no thought to what the user was actually trying to accomplish. So what if we broaden the definition of performance? What if performance stopped being about seconds, it stopped being about that raw speed, and started to think about how efficiently can users accomplish their goals? When they come to my site, if they want to make a purchase, how quickly do they come from getting to my site to when that purchase is made and they have the item that they need? How long does it take for them to be able to come to my site and find the relevant article that they were looking for? Whatever that task is, they always have a primary goal on your site. How long and how efficient is that process for them to get to where they want to go? I think it's a subtle shift, but I feel like if we shifted the conversation more to this, everything else would kind of just fall in place. We'd start to realize that it'd be painfully obvious that performance is a business problem, that it's a content strategy problem, that it's an accessibility problem, that it's a security problem, that it's a user experience problem. We could go on and on. It's an information architecture problem. You name it. If you're inside of the organization, completing their task, that is your goal. That should be the goal of building the site. We have a performance problem, but it is 100% fixable. We can't fix it just with the technical solution because it's not a technical problem, it's a cultural one. We can't fix it with a top-down approach because top-down approaches have their own incentives, their own baggage. It has to happen from the bottom up. It has to happen with a cultural shift. It has to happen with a mind change in the way that we approach performance, and the way we discuss it, and the way we think about it. It has to happen from a recognition that performance has broader implications. We fix it by putting the user up front. We fix it by focusing on their objectives, on their tasks that they want to accomplish, and making sure that what we're timing, what we're paying attention to, is their process and their journey along the site, their journey along the application. We make sure that we're prioritizing their tasks and their goals up front. And if we do this, if we truly change the way we viewed performance to be completely user-centric, then we will end up building a web that is more resilient, a web that is more inclusive, and a web that is absolutely more performant. Thank you.